The 90s were a great time for comic book and video game fans. There were more games arriving with some of our favorite characters. We already had titles like Batman on the NES, Superman and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the arcade, and in the early years of the 90s, we got Spider-Man on the Sega Genesis and the arcade, and one of my favorites, Captain America and the Avengers. Developed by Data East in either a 2-player or 4-player version, the player can choose from the roster of Captain America, Iron Man, Vision, and Hawkeye. The game is a fun beat-em-up with a wonderful art style that appropriately captures the hand-drawn look of the comics at the time. Just look at those gorgeous background images. You need to take on the menace Red Skull and thwart his plans to create a giant laser that will allow him to take over the world. It is a quintessential arcade romp through 5 stages, with some side-scrolling shooting levels mixed in to break up the beat-em-up gameplay. While not a perfectly polished title, it still has a level of charm that eludes many beat-em-ups of that era. Sega worked with ISCO/Opera House to port the game to the Sega Genesis in 1992. This is a fairly faithful representation of the game. A few things had to be cut, such as voice samples and replace background images, which was likely to save space on the cart. Obviously, there were also additional graphical losses in the sprites due to porting it over to the Genesis' smaller color palette. Here the game retains that arcade experience with fast action and a killer soundtrack, sounding leagues above many Western-developed Genesis titles. The voices included give some nice laughs at times and punctuate a very classic view of Marvel Comics that is rarely seen anymore. But I also can't help but repeat many of the catchphrases from the characters as they show up. Thank you, Quicksilver! They sure don't talk like that in the Marvel films. The combat is quite different from most beat-em-ups. While you have your normal punches, using them effectively can be tricky. It's not as satisfying as the punch combos from, say, Final Fight or Streets of Rage. The enemies can be hard to tell exactly when you are connecting your hits, especially when they're in a group. You can also pick up an enemy and throw them to clear the way a bit. You will quickly find out the best attack method is probably using small jump kicks or range attacks. A welcome feature that is underused in most beat-em-ups is the ability to use special projectile attacks without the use of health or ammo, by pressing the attack and jump button at the same time. This comes with a trade-off. Other games might have a Mega Crush or a screen clearing move, but we don't have that here. For Vision and Iron Man, they can shoot an additional projectile attack down on enemies within a jump, while conversely, Cap and Hawkeye can only shoot a single projectile using the special attack in the air or ground. Each of the characters also has a dash maneuver and a tackle that they can use, as well as the ability to block by holding the punch button. The challenge of the game is not too bad. Basic enemies are usually pretty easy to take care of. Early bosses, similarly, are a cakewalk, but once you get later into the game, there are a few boss fights that can feel cheap, and you can easily lose lives on many of these, such as Juggernaut and Crossbones. Speaking of the bosses, there is an impressive cast of characters that show up, from well-known to obscure: Ultron, a Sentinel robot, Mandarin, Grim Reaper, and this odd version of Juggernaut, to name but a few. If the game is too much in the difficulty, you can crank it down a bit and also add more lives to make it through. Overall, it's not a super deep game, but it truly captures that early 90s arcade experience well, with a tone and atmosphere perfect for comic book fans. The following year, the same game was ported to the Super Nintendo by Real-Time Associates and published by Mindscape. Even though it has the advantage of coming out later than the Genesis version, it suffers even more due to some janky gameplay around the controls and hitboxes, plus some voices are not present here. It's widely regarded that the Genesis version is superior if you want to relive the arcade action at home. I still think the art style holds up incredibly well also. For me, an art style can really make or break my decision towards liking a game. I'll go into more detail in another video about this, but for now let's just say, as a kid, I did not like the way the Spider-Man beat-em-up ended up looking on the Super Nintendo at all. That same year, we also got Hyperstone Heist on the Genesis, which stands above Captain America and the Avengers. But don't let that dissuade you from playing this great little game that holds up quite well. Alright, and that's going to do it for today, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you have a good one, and I'll see you next time.